record. Okay, everybody, we're going to get started. I am so excited to have Sunshine Menezes here. She and I first met at the Inclusive Scicomm Communication Conference, Inclusive Scicomm Conference, at URI at the University of Rhode Island. And that conference was really focused on being very intentional about our science communication efforts and making sure that that is as inclusive and equitable as possible. For me, I was going there because at that time I was really working on my sourcing for my reporting on who gets to talk about science, who's a scientist, and like who science is for. And I had a lot of fun and learned quite a bit. And it's something that Joe and I are really focused on in our reporting and journalism, and something that I think everybody here should be focused on when they are communicating their science and keeping their audiences in mind. So Sunshine, if you would like to take it away, we're going to have Sunshine talk about inclusive science communication and this amazing conference that's coming up, and then we'll open it up to questions for everybody. So Sunshine.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Maddie and Joe, for the invitation. I'm thrilled to be here. Everyone can hear me okay? Good? Okay. Let me start by explaining. So first of all, I run a program at the University of Rhode Island called Metcalf Institute, and we've been doing science training for professional journalists from all over the world since 1999, and we've been doing science communication training for researchers since 2011. And so we've been in this training space for a long time. I went to a couple of conferences. Well, I was involved with this project that was designed to think about how to connect people working in science communication and people working in the informal science education world, which is like, they're very similar. There's a lot of overlap between informal science education and science communication, but these two worlds have been pretty siloed historically. So this project was intended to bring these two worlds together, specifically with a focus on making all of our work more inclusive. So I was involved with that task force for like a year and a half or so, and it really just had me thinking about a lot of different things. And then I went to several conferences, science communication conferences, and I was livid about the fact that there was no conversation at all at these two really important conferences about inclusion. And it was completely ignored. And I was pretty vocal about my frustration with this on Twitter, and decided after a while that that was an insufficient way to address the problem. Rather than just complaining about it, especially in a very public fashion, I thought, well, it's time for us to do something about this. So I pulled together a group of partners, and we started to develop this Inclusive Scicomm Symposium, which was held for the first time last fall. So our objective with that, we had a few objectives, but the primary thing with that symposium was we wanted to help elevate the fact that people are doing inclusive Scicomm already. It's happening. And it requires, like Maddie said, it requires intention, and that's really the foundation of what it requires. It requires intention. And then, yes, there are hard conversations to be had, and there are thorny issues to address, but it needs to be done, and it is being done. So when we developed this 1.5-day program last year, the focus was like, okay, who can we bring in from around the country who's doing this work? And then how can we help lots of other people who maybe want to be more inclusive and equitable and intersectional, but don't know how to do it, all the way kind of on the spectrum, from people who like are interested but don't know how to do it, to those who are really actively doing it already. Like, let's bring these folks all together and talk about what it takes to do this, and what are the barriers and what are the opportunities. So now with that, I'll come back to that in a minute, but let me back up and just talk about like, what do we mean when we talk about inclusive Scicomm? So first of all, we interpret science communication in the broadest possible sense for the sake of this conversation. So we're talking about journalists. We're talking about people who do science communication training, like Metcalf Institute. We're talking about researchers who do like engagement events with K through 12 students. We're talking about museums. We're talking about like any person and organization and program that is trying to engage specific audiences in conversations about science or STEM topics kind of writ large. Okay, so a very, very broad audience or suite of audiences for this conversation. And like I said before, we're really trying to think about like, how do we make sure, all of us who are doing this work, how do we make sure that we are starting from a point of inclusion with regard to everything you might imagine. So this is a conversation about race and ethnicity. It's a conversation about gender. It's a conversation about the LGBTQ plus community. It's about geography and socioeconomic status and age and nationality. There are many ways to think about inclusion or to exclude, you know? So it starts from a recognition that sometimes, often, we're not thinking about our audiences as holistically as we should be. And of course, and you all know this likely because of the conversations you've had with NPR SciCommers, audience is the most important thing when you're doing science communication effectively. You need to understand who it is you're trying to communicate with. And if you're going to do that well, then you need to think about not only like who are the people that automatically come to your mind when you're trying to do that communication, but who are the people that don't automatically come to your mind? And are you doing things that might make them feel less engaged or less welcome in the conversation? Or are you doing things that will very purposefully bring them into the conversation or develop a conversation that is for them specifically? So there are so many pieces that go into this. You know, it's about acknowledging that scientists are in fact human beings. You know, like all of you lovely humans on this call, we are humans. We have biases and like blinders and values and beliefs, all of us. And that means that none of us can be truly objective, even though this is of course what science has like aimed for a very long time. There is subjectivity in our views and therefore in the science that we do. So that's a really important acknowledgement. Also recognizing that things like museums aren't neutral either. There is also subjectivity in how a setting, a science communication or public engagement setting like a museum is established, the way the exhibits are created, the perspective that is displayed in that exhibit. Thinking about the way that we develop our public engagement activities. So say that you are doing a specific program where you are like going to a particular community or trying to engage a particular audience. Have you developed that engagement in a way that is not only appropriate for the people that you are trying to reach, but have you asked them what they're interested in? And actually tried to like have a real conversation to like co-create something that is meaningful and again feels accessible to everybody. And then another great example that Maddie just offered is sourcing. You know, so the ways that journalists are sourcing their stories, the voices that they're including in stories, all of these things are some examples of ways that science communication could be inclusive if we gave it some more thought from the beginning and not at the end. So often what happens is very well-meaning people say like, oh yeah, I have this project. I want to do some sort of science communication about something, and I've done this work, and now I want to like share it with the world. And oh, I better think carefully about who I'm including in my sharing it with the world piece. But the fact is that if you're not thinking about the inclusion aspect until the very end, it's almost impossible to be as effective in that goal as you could be if you started earlier in the process. To some degree, this also relates to, I mean, I realize that there are a lot of scientists on this call, right? So this is even about the way that we conceive our research from the very beginning. And that's like kind of a broader issue. But I think it's relevant because if you want to have, I work a lot with environmental science, and this is a very relevant issue for environmental science, but also for medical science and other types of science. But in environmental science, if you are looking at, the effects of extreme weather on water quality in a community or something, if you as a researcher start by saying like, okay, well, I want to go do this project. I want to understand how extreme weather is affecting water quality in this community. I'm going to go like identify my sites. I'm going to collect my samples. I'm going to analyze my samples. And then I'm going to go share this with the community. Okay, if you started by going to talk with the community before you started collecting your samples, or even before you finalized your approach toward the research project, you are engaging that community. That is science communication that is really meaningful, because you're giving everybody an opportunity to be part of the science, to inform the questions in the first place, since they're the ones who likely know what are the problems with water quality in that community. They may not have the scientific language for it, but that doesn't mean that they're not affected by it on a regular basis, and that they don't recognize some problems. So while that might seem like a little bit of a sidebar, I feel like it's actually a very relevant thing to think about as you're kind of conceiving the ways you want to engage different communities.
Sunshine, can I say something here?
Yeah, please.
Well, I was just thinking that so much of this is just like hitting really, really true. And I think there's this idea, especially for myself, like as an ally, that, like bringing in diverse voices and having different perspectives, not only of like racial perspectives, but like you said, geographical perspectives and all this stuff, that this is like the right thing to do. And it is, but we kind of sometimes minimize like how much better that just makes our reporting and our science. Like you said, if you're talking to the community, you might identify a site that you would not have been able to identify them without working in those communities. For me, the more people, the more perspectives I talk to makes my journalism stronger. So it's not like an altruistic thing where I'm like, this is the right way to do it. I'm thinking like, no, this is actually makes my storytelling much better when I'm not talking to the same types of people all the time. And so this idea that like there's something like about the right thing or the wrong way to do this, that's true, but like do not lose sight of the fact that you engaging with communities and being very intentional about having an inclusive science communication approach is not going to make your stuff better. Like that is partially why we do it, right? And for me, most of it is because we really think that it could make your science communication way better. And that happens in community events, that happens in museum events, it's just like a point that I was just like, huzzah, and I couldn't be quiet. So, sorry.
Huzzah, indeed. Yeah, totally. Thank you for making that point. I appreciate it. You're absolutely right. I totally agree. Okay, so another thing that I wanted to talk about were some of the issues. Okay, so like what are the challenges to doing this? Because I'm not suggesting that this work is easy. So some of the challenges, and we heard some of this from people who attended the symposium last year, so I'm not just making this up. People said, okay, I want to do this, but I don't have the resources, like either usually money. Sometimes people would say I don't have the resource of time, although I would argue that this is something, especially for the reason that Maddie just pointed out, like this lack of time isn't a good excuse. Like you make time, you figure this out, you add this into your whole process. But also like lack of training, and especially as science communication training is something that thankfully is becoming more and more common. How to do things inclusively is often not part of the training conversation. So those are some really important absences. Another important absence that relates to kind of overall confidence that a person might have in approaching their work in an inclusive fashion comes down to language. And this is a really important one. I don't want to undermine this at all, or underemphasize it at all. Because when you start having conversations about equity, and who's included and excluded, those conversations can get really hard really fast. And that's part of it. That's part of the process, and that's part of the work, but because often people are afraid, they're like, I don't want to offend anyone. I want to do this. I'm afraid that I lack the language or the skill to have those hard conversations. So that's a really important thing that people feel they lack, right? But there are also then structural barriers. And so, Joe and Maddie and I were talking about this before the chat got started. One of the biggest structural barriers in academia to this is the fact that science communication just is not valued as an activity still in academic settings, and even in some other settings, but obviously not in a newsroom. It's very valued in a newsroom, thank goodness, but it is, that's not the case in academic structures. So we need to think about all of the ways that we can help to change those institutional systems and structures to make inclusive approaches the norm rather than the exception. And then the last thing that, I'm really looking at this in broad strokes right now, but the last really major thing that's lacking to do inclusive SciComm more is the lack of opportunity for people to get together and just have conversations about it. I know how to do this, but I don't know how to do that. I need help with this. I can help you with that, whatever. So that was another one of the inspirations for the Inclusive SciComm Symposium. So last year, like I said, that was what we were after. We wanted to show the world that this is important, people are doing it, and we can get together and learn from one another. So that's what we did. We did it over a day and a half. We brought in people from all over the country who are working in different settings using very different approaches. We had a keynote talk that is on the inclusivescicomm.org website last year by Dr. Rachel Burks from St. Edward's University in Austin, Texas. That was amazing. If you ever need to get the wind under your sails again after a bad day, go watch this talk by Rachel because it was incredibly inspiring. So she's an analytical chemist, and she engages people in really great settings that had never occurred to me honestly before. So for example, she goes to things like Geek Girl Con and Dragon Con and talks about how chemistry applies to these various fictional worlds. So for example, one of the things that she's talked about is how there's this famous scene in Game of Thrones where the horrible King Joffrey gets poisoned by some drink, right? So she said to the folks who were very interested in the Game of Thrones world at DragonCon, well, let's think about what might have been in that glass that he drank that might have poisoned him. What are the various approaches one might have taken to develop a poisonous cocktail? What I love about that is that she's saying, I'm going to go to this community that is thinking about these fictional kind of sci-fi things, and I'm going to have a conversation with them. I'm going to talk about real science within a milieu that's familiar to them. Danielle Lee at Southern Illinois University, a professor there, has an amazing TED Talk about how she approaches science communication through a hip hop frame. So she refers to famous hip hop songs and themes that come up in hip hop and uses that as the way to communicate about science. Daniel Aguirre from the Fleet Science Center in San Diego developed with a team of people this group of, this series of public engagement activities with this primarily Latino community in this very diverse Latino community in San Diego. And so they focused and they developed the programs together. Like he said to the community, what are you interested in learning about regarding STEM? And they came up with a bunch of ideas. And one of the things that came out of that is this local man who was renowned for creating really amazing lowriders. He led a series of workshops about how to build a lowrider. And so this is engineering, you know, this is public engagement with science and engineering in a really meaningful and community appropriate way, you know. So anyway, we featured a whole bunch of people doing this work in very different spaces, and it was amazing, and we decided that we needed to do it again. So this year we are doing the Inclusive SciComm Symposium again, September 27th to 29th. It will once again be held at the University of Rhode Island. And after this year, we're going to move to like an every other year timeline to do these national symposia. But this year, 3 days in Kingston, Rhode Island in September. I can tell you it's a very nice time to visit Rhode Island. And the symposium is going to cover 3 main themes this year, really building off of what we heard last year. One of them is, excuse me, different languages and different ways of knowing. And by language, I don't just mean like, you know, English, Spanish, German, whatever, but like literally different ways of communicating about science, and different ways of knowing, like Western, non-Western ways of learning and understanding information. We're going to talk about changing systems and structures. We're going to talk about the ethics of science communication. We're going to talk a lot about this issue of how to have difficult conversations across difference. So we're taking a lot of like the hard stuff on in this symposium, and I expect that it's going to be another really amazing experience for everyone who attends. We have very discounted rates for students. So for 3 days, it's $100. We're going to offer lodging, scholarships. There will be the opportunity for some people to get waived registration if they can't afford those registration fees. We're going to do a poster session this year, which is different from last year, knowing that often for students, it can be easier to get your university or, you know, your supervisor or whatever to support travel if you can actually do a presentation. And if you don't want to do like a panel presentation or something, you can submit a poster. So there will be an opportunity for that. Registration will officially open next week, so you can get a lot more information at inclusivescicomm.org on that as of next Monday. And I think that's like the big picture. That's what I wanted to say. So I am very happy to answer questions, to hear like if you all are doing things related to inclusive science communication, where you feel the gaps are or the needs are. I'd love to hear any of that from you.
So guys, if you have questions, just scroll, like move your little mouse down and you'll see a little option to raise your hand, and then I can call on you and you can take yourself off mute, or I will, and ask questions. There was one question already, which was from Kaylee, and she was saying, what exactly do you mean about having the language for it? And you were saying that language is really important. What do you mean by that?
I mean, so if you're talking, when people are talking across differences is the term that we use, meaning like you have even just 2 people sitting down having a conversation, and those 2 people are different in whatever ways. Obviously, they could be different in many ways because each of us carries many identities with us. But say you have people like one person who has a disability and one person who, you know, is doesn't have any disabilities, or there are like ethnic differences or cultural differences or whatever, you know, there could be various types of differences between these 2 people having a conversation. And so it's easy to make assumptions. And in fact, this is what we all do all the time. We make assumptions based on what we know. And those assumptions work for us because they're based on our lived experience. But those assumptions may not work for the other person. And it can be really hard to find the language to talk across the differences that you have, that again is respectful, isn't offensive. And people literally, I mean, I had many, many conversations about this at the symposium last year with a lot of people who felt like they were afraid to wade into a potentially difficult conversation because they feared they didn't know the right words to use that would resonate with the other person or the other group. So it is literally like, so for example, I was just reading a blog the other day written by this woman. The blog's called like the Neurodivergent Rebel, I think. So she's autistic, and she was talking about language, you know, like, so if you're, so she had a little video about this, and she said, so how should you talk about someone who's autistic? Should you call them an autistic person or a person with autism? And she gave her thoughts on this as someone who's hashtag actually autistic. So that is like one example of language. And while that might sound like not a big thing to some of you, the reality is for some people, even saying an autistic person versus a person with autism can be a significant difference in language. A person can respond to those different terms very differently depending upon the person. And so you can wade into a conversation when you're talking about communication, when you're talking about science, when you're talking about anything, and fear that you don't have the right language or be offended by someone else's language that is not sensitive to your perspective. So does that help? Does that clarify things?
I think that helps a lot. Another example of this that is prevalent in my life is just use of like pronouns. So, you know, I have quite a few non-binary friends, and you know, like they've met my parents, and I can definitely see my parents being like, oh, I don't know, how do I refer to them? And I was like, maybe their names, you know what I mean? Like maybe use their names. But you know, I'm joking about it, but it's something that's very real, and it's something that, like, as you know, for me as an ally, I've definitely gone into spaces and being like, I'm way over my head here. And like part of being a good ally, I think, and Sunshine can correct me, is knowing that you're going into a space that is a little bit over your head and trying to be as open and as compassionate and realizing that like you are going to mess up and that you are going to learn from that, and that like it is not the responsibility of a person that you're talking to take care of you and make sure like I'm having soft pause with you and like, oh, it's okay, like you called me this, but I really prefer that. Like you will enter into conversations where you say the wrong thing, and that person will take something from that and be upset with you, and that is their right, and that is how you learn from those situations. When you go into a group like the Inclusive Scicomm Symposium, where that is the intention of that, and that people are expecting you to be learning there, these are the kind of places that you learn in a safe environment how to interact with people. And that's what I think that one of the most powerful things about the Inclusive Scicomm Conference is that people there know that you're there to have this intention of learning. So when you do mess up, that as long as you're being as respectful as possible, that's kind of one of those great venues to learn. So yeah, that was just an example from my mom not knowing how to handle us millennials, as she says. Okay, let's see. I'd love to raise my hand. If you can't talk out loud, you can send them in the chat. So Joe, I will get to your question after the other humans. You have to wait. And what do you mean you can't find a raise your hand icon? Just scroll over your screen, pal. That's just a little paw. All right, fine. Okay. Okay, so this is somebody that can't raise their hand because they're in lab. How do we be inclusive without making somebody feel tokenized? I run an outreach group that works with K-12 students. Many collaborating schools are pretty well off, and we like to sometimes work with schools that are more struggling. How do we target those schools and support them without the potentially giving them a we need to work with a poor school vibe?
Good question. The first thing is to just reach out and say, hi. this is what we're doing, and we'd love to have a conversation with you about whether this is something you're interested in. It's literally just getting in touch and saying, we have something to offer. We'd love to have a conversation with you. Are you interested? And if you're interested, tell us what you have to offer. Like, how can we come together and come up with a program that is of interest and relevant and inclusive for your school? So I think the biggest, in general terms, the biggest thing I'd say is not assuming that you know the right way to do a thing in every setting. And this comes right back to what Maddie just said. Humility is an incredibly important attribute when you're trying to be inclusive, and a recognition that you'll mess up at some point. It's inevitable. But your willingness to accept that that's part of the learning is part of the process. So yeah, I would just reach out. I mean, if you don't reach out, then you're not doing anything, right? So like, reach out to a community member even, like if you know someone, so say you don't like have a contact at a particular school, but you know someone whose kids go to a school that you haven't worked with before that you'd really like to work with. You could start with that parent. You could start with a parents association or something. You could start with the administration. You could start with a teacher. But whatever it is, go there with an open mind and say, like, we'd really love to do something with you. What can we do?
Joe, I see you have figured out how to raise your hand. Congratulations. I will lower your hand and I'll unmute you. Go ahead, Pekka. Oh, thought I unmuted him. Are we just doing it at the same time?
No, I just have to, yeah, I don't know who did what. And by the way, your tone does not sound inclusive. What I was struck by, and it kind of goes back to something we were talking about earlier, is you can, maybe this is a problem unique to mass communication, but I have to make certain assumptions about what the audience wants, could be, and it is, I would argue, impossible to hit all the buttons at the same time. So I guess my question is this a relevant, obviously there's some relevant points for a mass communicator, but is this a message that's more relevant to communication on a more intimate level? Or is there something that you would suggest that I do to change what I've been doing?
Yeah, I do, a lot of what I said, I think, is primarily relevant to the smaller scale interactions. However, the very thoughtful sourcing that you all are trying to do is part of this. Also, something that is really important in mass communication is not just like who are the sources, but also who are the reporters, who are the editors, are the people who are making decisions, the gatekeepers in newsrooms, are they representing the scope of voices that can inform the very ideas of what makes for a good story? So yeah, I think that there are a lot of lessons for journalism here also, and some newsrooms are, not very many, some newsrooms are attentive to this, most aren't. I think that, sourcing I feel like sourcing is the lowest hanging fruit for journalism to be more inclusive. And there's no excuse not to, there are binders full of people out there, if you'll forgive that reference. But yeah, the bigger issues are how newsrooms are structured and who they're hiring and who they're elevating. And I'm not suggesting this is something that you specifically have control over, Joe or Maddie, but I think that, to answer your question, I feel like that's a really big piece of what needs to change. That's a systemic or structural change that needs to happen in journalism. this is a long-standing conversation in journalism, I know, but obviously not one that's been fixed.
Yeah. No, I hear, I mean, yes, it's not, from where I sit, I'm actually have very little direct authority over who gets hired and who doesn't. But it does also feel like, the only real appropriate thing I can do is step aside and let somebody else come in that is more representative. And, I mean, part of me says it's time to do that, and part of me says, no, I like my job. The other thing that you were making me think, I mean, just to warn you about even choosing diverse sources, is I still pick and choose within what the source says for the message that I think is most appropriate, and that might be wrong. So, I mean, it's just a lot of challenges. I'm these things are coming into my consciousness more and more.
Yeah.
But I don't know that it's infiltrating it will slowly, the media world, but slowly.
Right.
Okay, I get that. Ray, you've got a question. Go on, Ray.
Yep. Hi. So my question is about if you're working for an institution, right? You're a part of a museum, a planetarium, a science center, a government center. How do you strategically bring up topics of inclusion, or how do you ask your institution to make a statement, for example, or talk about certain things? So let's say with the whole new things at the telescope in Hawaii, how do you tell your center that, how are we going to make a statement? What is our role here to be more inclusive? But yeah, in a strategic way.
Yeah, that's such an important issue. And so this is obviously very context dependent, very situation dependent, and also, to be honest, very dependent on the identities of the person who wants to push this forward, right? So let's just say you have like some more marginalized identities, and you decide you want to push this in your institution. Well, it is easy for the powers that be to further marginalize you in that situation. Be like, oh, well, so says like the African-American woman, but she's just one person here. Or so says, the person in the wheelchair, whatever, right? Like they're the one person that has that opinion. And of course they have that opinion because they're one of these marginalized groups. So this happens all the time. And I think that the answer that I would have for you, and I'm not claiming to have like the answer, but my suggestion would be identify your allies and figure out. And so this is a series of private conversations to kind of feel out the temperature of the room, so to speak. Like who are the people who I can count on to agree and support this. Now, here's another caveat. So you get enough of those people together as a group. You say, this is important to us. We want our institution to make a stand on this, to make a statement. The caveat is, be very sure that you really have those allies, that you're all on the same page before you bring that forward, or you risk being left kind of high and dry. And I had a conversation with a friend of mine who did exactly this not too long ago. He felt really strongly that his institution needed to do something specific or change their approach in terms of being inclusive with this target community, in fact. And he had gotten a couple people who were going to side with him in a big staff meeting. And then when the meeting came, those people just they just shut up. They didn't want to say a word. So he was literally left dangling in the situation. So you need to be sure that these are people you trust. And, but yeah, so I guess that's what I would offer. That is a really unsatisfactory answer, but I think it's a real one.
No, it really helps. Yeah, thank you.
So Sunshine, would you say that trying to be strategic about, and I guess in this example that you gave, it did not work, but to find an ally that has maybe, maybe is more of a decision maker at whatever that university or that place is. Find that ally and kind of bring things together as a group, as something that you could do. There's part of me that really hates that, because you shouldn't need in a lot of circumstances, something that a lot of my friends of color tell me is listen, we're going to need white people for this. We're just going to need them. And so, there's part of that I'm like, oh, that sucks. But it's also just really true it's in academia or anything, is find somebody who has power, if this is possible at your university. And then, you kind of make this a team effort instead of you presenting something on behalf of a thing, if that's a thing that's available to you. Because unfortunately, that's how it works everywhere.
Yeah. Okay,
Erin. Erin, I will unmute you now. Prepare. Oh, thought I did. I'm not doing it. Erin, can you unmute yourself? Yeah.
I got it. There I am. Hi.
Hi.
Hi. So in a different topic, I work with undergraduate students, and I am helping them learn about science communication at this earlier level, which isn't terribly well supported yet. I do work at a school that values promoting more inclusion and diversity. And so I wondered if you had one tip that you could give to students who are going and, say, doing an outreach event at a science festival for the very first time, what tip would you give those students?
One tip. Oh boy. You're really putting me on the spot here. I think okay, so I guess my one tip, if I were only given one, given what you just told me about the setting, because the setting is critical for figuring out what's most appropriate and effective. But given what you described, I think that they should go there, that they should be as open to the experience as they possibly can be. So they should go there trying to minimize their assumptions about who is going to be there and why they're there and what they expect to learn and or to experience, and think more about how can hey, there is a person in front of me. I want to engage that person.
Right.
All I care about right now is that person or these couple people, whatever it is. I want to, again, forgive this phrase because I kind of hate it. I want to live in the moment and experience this with another person.
Sure.
And then to reflect back on that afterwards, after their experience, what did they take away from it that they hadn't expected? What were the things that they felt, that they learned from that exchange that can help them do it better next time?
Good. I say a lot of those things too. I was just curious what your take was on it for people who are brand new.
Yeah.
The very first time they might go out and do something like this. It can be daunting, but it's also really exciting. And I think students are particularly interested in exploring. They don't have a lot of preconceptions, so it's a great time to address these kinds of things. So thank you.
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
I just want to point to something that Joe put in the chat because I think it's really great. He said one thing that Ray, you could do, and I saw that you saw this, but I just want to make, is go and scour your website for any language about inclusivity or diversity, because you can say, hey, according to you, we have a requirement to do this. And this is something that I want to just pull, something that I just wanted to remark on. So being really intentional at the beginning, like Sunshine was saying, has been absolutely the number one thing that's helped me as a journalist. So in the Maddie About Science, which is the video series, I said in the mission statement, it is that we are going to represent the diverse perspectives and fields of scientists. And so when we got pushback at all about like, hey, this scientist seems kind of great, but their research isn't that engaging, I'm like, hey, this is my editorial priority that you signed on to when you let me host the show. And we're doing the same thing for the podcast, and we're trying to do some crazy stuff around the podcast, but having something that you can point to that said you already agreed to this is something that's really powerful. It's also something that for me, for a journalist, I can say, because sometimes it could be an awkward conversation when a press officer puts me in front of, like an older white man that's representing the story and say like, hey, our stories right now, our demographics at NPR are dominated by white men, and it's our editorial priority and in our mission statement to try and diversify that sourcing. And so having something that you can point to say like, we've already agreed on this is really important. And it's a very good argument for establishing that at the beginning of anything that you're going to do. So establishing that, like, it's something that we learned even from the SciCommers program is the first time we put that in the grant, we didn't establish that we wanted to have a firm commitment to conversations around inclusivity and diversity and equitable communication. And then this year we put it in there so that we have to deliver these conversations, and it makes it really a lot easier. So I just wanted to put in another plug for that because it has been a lifesaver for me. Okay, somebody else said, they can't use their mic. I also teach undergrad science writing and research methods, 2 separate courses. I'm curious if Sunshine knows of any introductory resources about bias and inclusivity in journalism and or research that might be undergrad appropriate.
Let's see, I'm just making a note here. Not that I'm coming up with off the top of my head, but I can look around a little bit and get back to Maddie.
Yeah, and we'll put resources like we always do in the mentor chat. So, like Rachel's talk and any links that Sunshine sends us, we'll put in the channel. Sometimes that takes a little bit of time to get in there, but we'll put those in there.
I'll also note another resource that I'll share with you is something that we started developing last year, and it's intended to be this crowdsourced resource list for inclusive Scicomm, again, writ very large. So I'll share that link, and then if any of you have things to add to it, please do.
Okay, Hope, why don't you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Hi, I'm do SciComm for the Innovative Genomics Institute in Berkeley. So I'm writing about genome editing all the time. And yeah, I just actually had a question about the conference that's coming up. And I'm wondering, is it like aimed like mostly at people doing outreach and education versus more like journalism or PIO jobs?
It is all of the above and more.
Okay.
Yeah, so we really very purposefully right now are casting a very wide net for this because the field of inclusive science communication is still so young and so much growing to do that we would much prefer to have a really big tent right now, and then we can, depending, it can get smaller. But now, the more the merrier. We have a limitation in terms of the number of people we can accommodate. It's only 160 people, so it's fairly small, but that's nice because it makes for really nice sized conversations,
Yeah.
But yeah, we have people coming from all of these different kind of applications and many different sectors. So we'd love to have you.
Thank you.
Maddie, you're muted.
Yeah, I know. I knew that. Like I said, when everybody could hear it, does anybody else have any questions? We've got about 7 more minutes of Sunshine's time. Nope, nobody?
While you're thinking, go ahead.
Oh, hang on, never mind. Okay, go ahead, Sunshine, what were you gonna say?
I was gonna say something, this is following up on something that Joe was saying before. he said, you know, like, I could step aside, but I'm not ready yet. I'm not suggesting you should step aside, Joe. But
I am. Just to be clear, get out of here.
But the idea of stepping aside, though, is something that's worth a little bit more conversation, because one of the ways to be inclusive in certain situations is to step aside, is to say, like, oh, okay, thanks for the invitation, but I would like to pass that invitation along to another person who maybe hasn't gotten on your whoever you are, on your radar yet, or maybe they're a younger professional, or maybe they're a grad student or whatever. Like, I know this person who can do the very same thing you just asked me to do. And in this story that I'm telling you right now, like, I have gotten a bunch of attention already, you know, like, I don't need any more attention. I don't need any more opportunities, whatever. But this person does. So I want to, like, as one of my very good friends say, you know, lift as you climb. So I want to, like, give this other person an opportunity to be elevated. And it's as simple in some instances as saying, like, thank you, but here's another option.
Awesome. There was one more question. Just for clarity, what do you find the biggest difference to be between the terms inclusivity and diversity?
Good question. Okay, so diversity is kind of about proportions, you know, like, okay, we have, like, or numbers even, you know, like, we have X people that, like, represent this group and X people that represent that group, and many different types of representation. That's diversity. Inclusion is not about numbers. It's about access and equity. It's about everybody having equal opportunities to participate in a conversation, in a debate, in an activity, and feeling welcome to do it. So, you know, inclusion is a process. Diversity is like a number or kind of representation thing. Does that need further clarification?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, I think I think you said it really well. And it's something like, yeah, so for example, like, you know, with us, like, we have, you know, we want to make sure that the SciCommers community is very diverse, meaning that we have people from all over. But that to us is not enough. And for a lot of grant funding agencies, it is. So we built inclusion metrics into the grant as well, meaning, like, how many conversations are we going to have around diversity and inclusion? How many people of color are we going to make sure are publishing through the office hours program? Like, basically providing something for somebody, like providing access to resources in a way that makes it so that there's a benefit for people, as well as just you getting, like, the numbers that you would like. And that's, I think, you know, one of the reasons when Sunshine says, like, for journalism, like, you know, sourcing is diversity, basically. Inclusion is building a show or a sound that brings all those perspectives and has a real commitment to telling stories in an inclusive way, if that makes sense, if those are some more examples for you. If you agree with, I don't know if you agree with that, Sunshine.
Totally, yeah.
What else do we have? Any other last minute questions? We have 2 more minutes of sunshine, literally 2 more minutes of sunshine.
Hopefully more minutes of sunshine.
Right. Oh, Ray, one more. Pop in here, Ray.
Hi, I'm trying to figure out how to ask this question so that it makes sense. So I was working on an inclusive Scicomm comic, and what Maddie reminded me was that make sure to be inclusive and showing inclusivity. So I guess my question is, when you're designing, let's say, workshops, training, and everything about inclusivity, what should you remember to not be in this ironic position of doing something inconsiderate when talking about inclusivity? Does that make sense? It's like, really.
Can you give me an example? I'm struggling. Not quite.
So my example was when I was doing all these different comics, I think most of the people were white Americans. And Maddie reminded me that I needed also more diversity. If I'm talking about diversity, now let's say you're having a workshop or a training session, right? How should you be considerate of when you're talking about inclusivity and diversity, that there are cultural considerations, for example, when talking about it?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. Yes, there are many cultural considerations in every setting you could come up with. And I think one way to do that is to get other opinions on the work that you're doing, and again, from the beginning. So as you're conceiving of your comic book in this example, like talking with a bunch of other people who, again, bring their own different perspectives to it, and saying, oh, I'm thinking about doing this and that and blah, blah, blah. And so then you might get comments like the one you got from Maddie. Well, make sure just like the representation in that comic is demonstrating that you're practicing what you're preaching. So it's very much like what I said before, I guess. I think that the idea of getting early input and co-creation when that's appropriate, that's not always appropriate, but it is in more situations than we often think, is a good way to head off some of those possible pitfalls. Probably not all of them. And that's okay. This is a learning process, it is just so important to stress that we make mistakes and we learn as we go. And as long as we're really learning and that therefore like responding and adapting based on what we learn, I think that's totally okay. It's totally fair. It's when we assume that we're like, okay, I know what I'm talking about. I'm an expert on this. I am like the queen of inclusive Scicomm, and therefore I don't need to ask anybody else's opinion. That's when we get caught, because we're constantly learning when it comes to inclusion and equity. All of us, no matter who we are, no matter our experiences, everybody's got some kind of bias. So acknowledging that bias is really important, and then just getting lots of feedback. Does that answer your question?
Yes, yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, well, it is 2:01. Sunshine, we appreciate you so much. Everybody, I will post this in the Mentor Chat channel, and Sunshine and I will keep chatting at each other, and we can put some resources up there as well. But this was wonderful, so let's all thank Sunshine like this.
Thank you.
All right, bye y'all.
Bye.